Welcome back to another podcast episode of the Reframe Series. And today we are going to be introducing you to Anjuli Sherin, who is a Pakistani-American licensed marriage and family therapist specializing in trauma recovery, resilience building, and cultivating joy. She has over 16 years of practice working with immigrant, South Asian, Middle Eastern, Muslim, and LGBTQI populations. Sherin received her bachelor's in sociology and anthropology from Mary Washington University and her master's from CIIS. She has trained and mentored with leading figures in trauma recovery and energy psychology, including Richard Strauss Heckler, Stacey Haynes, and Vienna Stibal. In addition to awards for academic excellence and community service, Sherin received the 2007 Emerging Leader Award from the E-Woman Network and has been featured in O Magazine as a finalist for the O Magazine White House Leadership Project. Her new book is Joyous Resilience, A Path to Individual Healing and Collective Thriving in an Inequitable World. I am just so excited to have you here today. I loved reading your book, and I just am so excited to be able to share this with our audience because I think you're amazing. So just thank you so much for being here. And I want to get us started with the first question for you. The book that you've written has been so thought-provoking for me. It really focuses on helping to bring more self-awareness and understanding. So I wanted to really understand, how did you develop the concept and what influenced your goals for this endeavor?
Well, first, just thank you for having me on. And like we were talking about just before we got on, it is such a pleasure to meet a reader who engaged with the book and like really found it useful. And then I also really love that it's for the Rethink AC podcast, because the book is so much about rethinking, right? Like, what is mental health? What is wellness? And then I think specifically for the viewers of this, like, what does it mean in a way to be South Asian? All the different versions of South Asian, it could be all the versions of Desi. And how does that intersect with how are we well, right? And what does it mean to be joyous and resilient? So anyway, I'm really excited to be here. And then, so what drew me? I mean, I guess in some ways, the best way is like what draws you is what you need yourself, right? You probably heard that saying, we like teach what we most need to learn. And I mean, this Joyous Resilience, the book, I always demystify, especially as like a therapist, to say, just because I wrote a book on Joyous Resilience, or just because all of that, stuff that you just said about the bio does not mean that one has reached some kind of apex. The point of the book and my work is really to go, this is a constant learning and a constant evolution around what is it to be resilient. And then I think this idea of, it's important, like talk about joy, like especially I'm from Pakistan, right? So I think I find it kind of revolutionary in a way for a Pakistani woman to be saying, and I'm also joyous and I'm Pakistani in the world we live in, because that's a facet that I think sometimes isn't talked about or seen. And especially in the past couple of decades of living in America, I came over, I think, a few years before 9/11. Certainly Pakistani woman joy did not really go together. So just that is its own act of, like I said, revolution or defiance, or in a healthy way, like really to go, all kinds of things exist within us. And this part of my life is important. It's part of our lives as people is important. How do we feed that? To back up, the book comes out of, I feel very lucky and privileged that, for many different reasons, in a very early age, like in my early 20s, to understand that just the process of immigration from Pakistan to America and coming over solo, so my family still lives there, and like all that it is to be 20 anyway, without any of that. But then to be in your early 20s and you're navigating college in a new culture, relationships, being free for the first time, which I think anyone South Asian diaspora coming over from those countries understands. When you leave your parents' home or the cultural home, the freedom that comes. Certainly I grew up in a much more restricted society. How to navigate all that really meant that there was a lot of emotional upheaval that was happening. And it looked for me like, I wouldn't have called it this, but in hindsight, right, it looked for me like anxiety. It looked for me like a lot of like relational anger or irritation actually, which isn't always true. I think especially for women, anger can sometimes be pretty suppressed. So I came the opposite route. It was pretty out there, and it meant that relationally I was getting into conflict, not able to sustain. But mostly it was just a big up and down, emotional up and down, and no idea what was going on. And certainly I had not heard growing up, right? Like, have you thought about therapy? That is such a rare thing. Back then, I think a little bit more okay now in like Pakistan. But here, thankfully, someone nudged me. Actually, a coworker, which was, it's kind of like it can come from anywhere, nudged me to go, have you considered this? And so getting over that taboo, because I was like, what? Me? I don't need this. What is this thing? Again, I think that that's changing definitely out here, and definitely if you're living on the coast, if you're listening to this in like America. But I would say culturally, broadly, though, still, and generationally, still a taboo. But thank goodness for that, Arpita, because what it meant was that pretty early through individual therapy, through group therapy, was actually very useful, through watching people of different ages and different races and different cultures and backgrounds grapple with the same issue of why are we feeling what we're feeling? How do I even know what I'm feeling? Oh my gosh, my body actually gives me clues about that, and I could listen to that. I mean, that was mind blowing, right? Otherwise, all I knew was my tummy hurts. I feel really down. Gosh, I'm getting a headache. I don't want to go to work. I love it when you're nice to me. I hate it when you're not. I don't know what to do about it. So it just gave me language for my sensations and my emotions. That was huge. And then therapy really helped me to translate those into needs, that actually there was needs buried in it. Things I needed to say yes to, things I needed to say no to. Again, no, I think culturally pretty difficult word. I still struggle with it. I remember asking my mom, like, what are boundaries in Urdu? Like, how do you say that? And like, I still am like, the word seems so strong. And I'm like, that's not it. It's not a wall. It's not a divar. It's not, I mean, it's a way of interacting, but it's not actually. Or how do you say privacy? Privacy instead of secrecy, in Urdu. So learning about there's needs, something called boundaries, something called limits. And then, of course, the third part, right? How do I begin to do that relationally? How do I begin to actually exercise that? First, with people maybe a little bit lighter. The most difficult one is always with family, getting over and working through guilt or shaming, which I know can happen in our culture sometimes. I mean, it's just part of it seems like it's been mixed in with love, differentiating between love and guilting and shaming, and like love and obligation, as opposed to like a genuine ethic of this is from my heart versus because I think I have to, otherwise you won't love me and you're going to ostracize me. All of these things, I see you nodding. I mean, I think these are just part of the diaspora. They're also, I just want to say, part of many different cultures, but we're focusing here on South Asian, and they see diaspora worldwide. So sensations, feelings, articulation into needs, having needs actually into boundaries and limit setting and yeses in the world. I mean, that was hugely empowering. And I think early on, watching other people go through that and then seeing joy return, that the joy, the aliveness, the happiness, the loving that came from, I'm actually free. I feel the voices inside my head are calmer. I'm not criticizing and judging myself in the way that I've inherited. I'm also more open to other people's limits. I am better able to love in a way that's actually going, I want the best for you, and like want to figure out how we compromise without necessarily having to sacrifice. Another taboo thing for anybody who's hearing, right? I'm like, oh my gosh, isn't love sacrifice? What's the difference between compromise and sacrifice? So that just meant that I felt like there was no work in the world that I wanted to do more than this, to start to engage with groups, individual therapy. That's kind of the mix that I do, individual therapy groups, trainings, to really go, let's start to free ourselves relationally. And so the book emerged from that. And then the model, we can talk more about that. The model is based on one that I was taught pretty early. And I want to hear more from you. I can come back and tell people about that model. But the model really helped break down for me the voices in our head or the voices in relationships that basically keep us stuck. And then over the past 17 years of personal therapy and with clients, the book came out of that going, oh, actually, there's an alternate model. There are voices in our head that are alternate, that we can be with ourselves or with each other, that are the way that we thrive, actually. And so breaking this idea of thriving is grit, which can happen, right? Muscle over things, be strong, but don't really feel anything. Or it's just innate. You're just born resilient. And sure, you can have traits that your temperament, definitely helps you have things, have you bounce back faster. But this is more a process. It's a way that we can be with ourselves. And I hope from this actually communally too, right? That we go, instead of criticizing and neglecting, basically, we'll get into that in a moment. When we're feeling vulnerable, instead of criticizing and neglecting, we actually move into nurturance, boundary setting and protection, soulfulness, creativity, right? We support ourselves in thriving instead of these things that we've learned to survive that break us down. So that's a big mouthful of like how some of where it came from.
Yeah, everything you've shared and said so far, I can definitely relate to and recognize those aspects in my own journey. It's so nice to meet someone like you who's gone through so much healing and really and helps transform other people's lives as well through the tools and techniques that you've learned. So, yes, I'm very excited to kind of get into the questions of the way that you approach your work from a heart-centered place rather than just a thought-centered place. When I was reading it, what struck me was really the way that the book was structured, which focused on providing some very useful frameworks in terms of the cycles that create struggle within us, as well as the tools and techniques that we can use to build resilience. And what appealed to me most was that you really went very deeply into each of these aspects and would provide case studies of what that actually looked like. Afterwards, we would have exercises that we could use to actually approach that for ourselves. And I felt very called in reading some of those sections because they felt so personal in some ways, because I could relate to the struggles of the individuals that you were talking about. And I think many of us can, because there are aspects of our lives where we are all struggling and we don't necessarily know whether it's imposter syndrome or whether it's dealing with being a caregiver for someone, how we're supposed to approach the world. So when I read those things, I definitely wondered to myself, how did you even approach writing this? And what were some of the challenges that you ran into? And how did you approach structuring this book to be able to cover such a difficult topic of developing resilience when dealing with an unequal world?
Yeah, and you make me go back to like, I'm like, how did I? Sometimes when it's done and you're like, what?
It's so good.
This came out? Let me see. I guess if I again pull back, one thing I want to just reflect back to you, I really feel, I mean, I wrote the book. First thing I kept in mind was like this idea of, I know there are not that many books. I'm a huge reader. I'm a big book nerd, you know, and so, and then of course, self-help, psych, and all the trainings. But I knew, especially like watching with my clients, like definitely like I have a pretty diverse roster. I've always wanted that when I recommend books in self-help and psych, and they're really good books, I know that it's really hard because the examples, the stories generally tend to be white and do not tend to have complex layers around just, you know, race, class, gender, ability, sexual orientation, all these things, all these multiple layers that majority of the people that I'm working with are grappling with and that I myself have grappled with. So it's beautiful to watch your face light up and have you say, I see myself, or, you know, when I was describing some of those issues, you know, South Asians deal with, or the Desi community deals with, and watching you nod, it's affirming for me too. And that was one part of the book, is that it's healing. Like, I think your podcast is healing, just to look at each other and go, me too, and this thing and this thing. And I mean, it's both heartbreaking and healing, right? Because it's also like, oh, I wish not you. I wish you did not know these things. But we need to be able to to be able to be like seen and reflected in the stories. And I think especially if we're going to do mental health work and stuff, that's one of the big gaps. So it's beautiful to see that. And that was one of the things that I was channeling when I was thinking about the book, is like, in these examples, in everything that I write, how do I make it more complex than just, you know, this kind of two-dimensional character who lives a particular life from Hollywood, I guess, or just general kind of whiteness that most people don't occupy, even if you're white, may not actually occupy, right? Like, how do we make these things complex? And so that came to the second part of the narrative, which you saw in the book, is for every case example, I work really diligently to say, and that's a big piece of this, is in general therapy, when you go to therapy, when you're doing self-help, general narrative, what you're going to hear is the things that you're dealing with probably are about what's happened to you in your life, and then going back a bit to your family. But what can be really hard there, and actually is a huge disservice, is that none of us exist in this vacuum of, like, our families and ourselves don't exist in a vacuum. They exist inside of the institutions, the systems, the culture, the history, the landscape, right? Like that actually have affected us. So that was very important to me, that for every example where, say, someone is struggling with, they're a people pleaser or they're overgiving, but then they also happen to be a caretaker, that we don't just go, oh, you're a caretaker, you should take better care of yourself, and like don't basically have better boundaries and do better. It's all on you, to, I don't know, get a babysitter, get some help, don't like have like limits on how much, and all that stuff could be useful. But what's very painful is, especially in this country, if you happen to be a caregiver, do you even have health insurance? What does your health insurance even cover? Is there anybody that you could actually bring into the home to help with the caregiving? How do we tell you have better boundaries if you don't actually honor and acknowledge what resources do you have, or how under resourced you are from our terrible, terrible healthcare system? And then, larger than that, the like institution of healthcare and the larger system, right? That basically goes capitalism, not going to take care of you. And then certainly if you're Black or brown or LGBTQ or disabled, like even less, right? So it was very important to me, like, kind of to go, yes, we're going to talk about resilience, but we're going to talk about it in the realm of all the different aspects that make it very hard to be resilient. And then, yes, we're going to look at where do we have power. Intrapersonal power is looking at what are we doing internally in that. Because if the healthcare system and the political system and capitalism is like letting me down, my family down, but then so here's the model for people who are listening. The thing that's going to cause suffering is then when I am feeling anxiety and depression, and of course, I'm like just like overwhelmed and stressed and my body hurts, am I then criticizing myself? So what happens if a voice we've inherited that then goes, well, other people are much more resilient, they're doing their job and they don't have this problem, and so what's wrong with you? Which again actually breaks me down further. Or it's okay, it's so overwhelming that I do the other voice, which is neglect. So then maybe I just go, oh my God, I just want to check out. And who doesn't? These just all these things are going on. But I start to like check out from my feelings and sensations. So I scroll on social media and I'm doing the Netflix and I'm doing the food that's not so good for me, or substances or addictions, or people pleasing, as in I'm going to tell the world. And this one is a big one in our cultures. I think I've been taught when I have those feelings, especially also if I happen to be in terms of gender, right, like female, then I have to put a smiley face on this thing. I'm going to go, I'm fine. How can I take care of you? Nothing going on. Suppress my irritation, my anxiety, my needs, my anger. So I'll neglect myself through people pleasing because I've been taught that's good, through getting, losing myself in things, also through being busy. I mean, of course, again, depending on gender or just different roles that we play, caretaker, of course, there's so many things I could be busy with. The world is on fire, forget about me. So we've been taught this and we go around in this because the more I do the neglect, the worse I feel. Short term, I might feel okay, but this thing isn't going anywhere. I still need those boundaries. I'm still depressed. Then I get to criticize myself more and make myself feel worse about how I'm showing up and what's wrong with me. And also, society isn't helping. Society is going, aren't we all supposed to have 1 million followers on Instagram and be doing 50 different things in our lives and magically working and also having babies and raising them and, taking vacations and all this stuff? And it's not real. So then it keeps on feeding this cycle of distress. And so the book is really talking about this thing is real. The good news about it is actually it stops the moment you even step back and realize it's not you. It's a way of responding to when you're in distress. And then the circle of resilience is the journey of building. The opposite of neglect is a nurturer. So if neglect goes look away, nurture goes this, come back in. How am I feeling? I do have feelings and I am here with myself, or I accept myself, building that capacity. I want to be kind to myself. I think if we even shifted some of our cultural stuff in a culture of kindness, and I think that we are kind people. There's a lot of love behind all of this. Let me take care of you. How can I do this for you? Probably in our cultural shape, the biggest shift is like, let me take care of you. How can I take care of you? Or, oh, Arpita, take care of yourself. Like, it's okay. You take care of yourself. That would probably be a big cultural into like nurturance, like real nurturance. Opposite of the critic is the protector. So that's the part I talked about where the protector goes, you deserve to be spoken to with respect. And we can find cultural ways. Like I also don't really subscribe to like boundaries of the same across cultures for everybody. But the protector is really saying, hey, like in this situation for you, and inside of the way that you hold it culturally, you still do get to have limits. You still do get to be asked, what does your body need? What does your heart need? Yes, maybe you have a lot of communal values. I think that's really beautiful. But even in community, if we are not going, are you okay? Are you giving too much? Like, are you squandering all of your energy and time and finances? Then you're basically going to come back into suffering. So, how do we begin to set and encourage limits, boundaries, needs, yeses, nos? And I think, especially as the next generations come along, I think we have more power to do this as we raise our children. So, that's the antidote to before I even get to the soul self and the resilient self. Imagine whoever's listening, if your heart was even just met with, when you're suffering, you're having a hard time with anything, nurturance and protection versus the neglect and the criticism, wouldn't you start to feel like, I feel a bit better? Maybe I can do this thing. Gosh, like there is some hope after all. I have some power or agency. I feel more at home or safe in my body, even if this world is doing its thing. Systems aren't changing yet, but I feel more at home. That is where the vulnerable self becomes the resilient self because of how you've cared for. And then the soul self I talk about in the book is just how do we tap into something much larger than ourselves, which I think culturally we have a lot of resources on spirituality, music, creativity. So activism, like when you're cared for internally in this way, it is from there that we can actually start to engage with and shift those systems. But that's the kind of cycle that we're talking about in the book. And I think, and that was kind of the thinking behind how do I walk people through a path that they can follow for themselves. And I'm glad to hear that the book does feel to you like that it is something you can do with your therapist or with your coaches, but you really could just pick up this book and start to walk yourself through yourself as well.
Yeah. So what I really loved in all of these approaches that you took in writing, and especially in thinking about not just from the individual, this situation is something that I've gotten myself into. You didn't do that. You really took a step back and placed that emphasis on I'm an individual living within society. And as someone who does data analysis for a living, who focused on really trying to look at demographic data and really understand where social inequities are coming from, I just loved that aspect of your book, especially around things like caregiving or just the impact external factors might be influencing internalized racism or internalized misogyny within ourselves and might be impacting the critical voice that we're hearing. And so being able to see those things written and listen to them, because I listened to the audio version, which is really good. I have both. So I wonder, like, what informs the kinds of studies that you looked at, and what kind of influenced your research around those aspects of your work? Because I really appreciated it. And in our work, we've been looking at something called solidarity economics, and underlying that is this recognition of the mutuality that exists within our society and really the need to uplift care workers and those who do work that is so fundamental to shaping our economy, but often goes undervalued and unrecognized.
It's cool to hear because you kind of sit on the opposite side of the spectrum. So much of my work really is like with individuals, right? It's kind of like in the day-to-day watching through experience. So it is cool to have someone who is much more in the stats and the research and all of that to value like what came out of it. I think for me, the thing is, I see it day to day, right? And I live it and we see it around us. And so, and also it's kind of more my nature to really look at that and go, I mean, the proof is in the pudding, the proof is in the body, it's in the society. But it was actually a good muscle for me to exercise in a way for the sake of the book, because I know there's all different kinds of readers. And also because I think it is actually important to back it up and go, yeah, this is not just hearsay. This is not just me saying, oh, wow, one person that I sat with had this experience, so must be society. Actually, thanks to people like you, thanks to all of these researchers, there's a huge body of knowledge that's out there that is tracking this thing, which again, devastating to read. I think there's like a section in the book, chapter 5, right, where I go through all the stats and I go, this is the level of violence against certain bodies that's happening. Not that we don't know it, because we see it. And I think the past few years, again, if you're in the States, I think in some ways useful for the people who have been able to, through privilege, put blinders on to see this is a level of violence day to day against Black bodies and brown bodies, trans bodies, all of that. So it was a good muscle, though, to go for every single thing I'm talking about. Let me go and now give thanks to, and it's all, tracked in the book. And if you are into that, you can look in the bibliography to see who's done research on, yes, where is this coming from? And also like, what level is this happening? So just in the caregiving chapter, right? All of that information, there's like data on what happens to the people, generally again, women who stay at home to provide caregiving, and the sheer drop in income, like just like financial security. So, and then like how that then translate into their own old age and what's available to them. And like, again, how disparate it is based on your race, right? No surprise really, anybody, but there is something about watching the numbers and go, oh my God, it's also systematic, because it's about white supremacy and institutionalized racism, which over the years meant that certain populations just got to have less and then got to pass on less and continue to. So I think biggest takeaway I'll say is for anybody who's not like a stats nerd or whatever, and I did my best to make it very relatable, because I wanted to just kind of give oomph for the story in a way to go, yeah, it's all right here, and it's important that we know, because I'm going to tie to the thing that you said about solidarity economy, right? I think at the end of the book, I talk about, okay, and all of this individual work, but obviously, if we're noticing now, we're waking up to how much larger systems, institutions are affecting us. May some of this work we're doing give us a resilience to start to engage with that bigger thing, because if we don't, this thing is poisoning. I mean, literally poisoning in terms of climate change, right? Poisoning our waters, it's poisoning our bodies, it's poisoning our ability to thrive, and it's not going anywhere. So I think that was also really useful to shift it to these stats prove that something bigger is happening, and may it get us excited about there's people out there doing work through movements to shift this thing. And I give a lot of suggestions at the end just to go, and here's where we could begin to just look at, engage. Again, things you don't talk about in like traditional therapy. But honestly, these days I would say, yes, people come in, and myself, I talk about, individual things in my life, what's happening in my family and this thing and that thing. But I also find over the past number of years, yeah, and I'm also talking about the political climate and climate change. And I'm worried about the rise of fascism and like, how's it going to affect me? And oh my God, healthcare and the pandemic. And it's not possible, I think, more and more, despite our privileges, to keep excluding the fact that we have to pay attention to systems, because they're really affecting us. And there's no bubble that can keep that out. So let's take care of ourselves so that we can start to take care of the stuff that's going on in the world.
Yeah, definitely. And I definitely related to those pieces in both like the stats and like the work part of me, but also just the personal piece, because my parents were caregivers for my brother, and I definitely could see like the impact that had on our lives, and the opportunities for being able to grow professionally as well as personally, and how that really impacted, I think, a large piece of our lives for decades. And I just really value what you did in there.
Thank you for sharing like your own personal experience, because yeah, through lived experience, right? And how now different would it have been if like just different things swooped in to hold all of you, like even just not having to worry. You all, how many things could catch us that don't, because the society is not having a nurturer or a protector in place. So
Yeah. So I love how you talk about how change does not come from inside alone. It requires a felt, embodied experience, and how you develop the book as a series of exercises in addition to the case study approach. So I know you talked about this a little bit earlier, but I'd love to know, like, even about your process for developing the exercises that you used, or just your thought process in developing this.
That's a great question. Thank you. I mean, I just love the parts of the book that you're pulling out. So that aspect of the book, right? This idea of like learning doesn't happen top down, though majority of learning, I think, is considered to be top down, right? Like I will hear about it or read about it and then I'll know it. But if you think about things like riding a bike, we didn't read a manual on riding a bike. We had to get on it and do it and be helping it, and then the body learned, right? So majority of the things that we learn there from the bottom, it's helpful. It's helpful to have the book. It's helpful to have the concepts, but then it's really about, can you feel it? Can you sense it? And then can you practice it? And so that comes from my background in somatic therapy. So somatic therapy really is a therapy that says, yes, of course, we have to talk, and like, that's a part of it. But we need to be able to have access to knowing the language of our sensations and what they're informing of us, the language of our emotions. And then let's take big ideas, like for example, the idea of boundaries, right? So you and I can talk about boundary, and I can say to my client, like, it would be good if you had a boundary, or like Arpita, like, take care of yourself and like make sure that you say yes and no. But for most of us, if in my body would have practiced, right? When I was little and I said, no, I don't want to do it, and someone either went smack or they looked at me and frowned or said, we don't do that. What I learned my body probably was pull in, quiet, or everything's fine. That's a somatic response. And just because someone says to me, like, don't do that, now 10 years, 20 years have gone by, doesn't mean that I'll be able to because I heard it. So in session, what that would look like, or in the book, we break it down into, as you saw, right? Like, have the learning, but now let's break it down into maybe what does no feel like in your body? What is the gesture of no? What would it be like to bring in an imaginal figure that tells you about actually being held, or hearing the words that actually soothe the things that you've never heard, like you're worthwhile, it's okay, I love you, I'm here for you. What are the gestures that model that? Let me put a hand on my body, or with no, let me actually practice a bunch of no's. It may sound strange if you're new to this, whoever's listening, but truly, like, I started a session with clients where it's like, no is that's weird, we're not doing this, all of this stuff, it's very scary. And then you give people a chance in a room to do like 10 pushaways and no's, and people start to be like, okay, it's more normalized, even kind of exhilarating. Give them a few weeks or a month, and it's like, great, like I feel more energy. And that translates into, and then we practice and go, let's practice. Let's practice trying to say, no, thank you, or actually, I'd rather stay home tonight, or wow, thanks for asking, I'll get back to you, or like what, all these normal things in that, but we were trained out of that. We're trained into, I have to check my email all the time because, oh my God, someone's waiting, right? So the somatic practice of like, I'm going to put that down, and I'm going to tolerate the sensations of unease that come up, and then I'm going to give it a few hours. All of that is teaching you to the body how to change behavior. So it's a long way of saying somatic therapy, and then also I'm hypnotherapy. So I'm also a hypnotherapist, which means work a lot in the imaginal realm, work a lot in the subconscious realm, which is where a lot of this stuff sits. Like consciously, most of it say, of course we should nurture ourselves. Of course I should be kind. That's all you're conscious. Subconsciously, there might be these beliefs of, yeah, but not if you're being lazy, or, we are, but I think there's like some limits on that. Or if you're too kind to yourself, you're going to spoil yourself. All the stuff that we took in, family, society, all of that. So the book guides you through, and the book comes with, by the way, for anybody who's listening, and maybe I can send you a link. I think, Arpita, you have it. Everybody will receive a link to 9 guided meditations. Those are hypnotherapy meditations. They're free. They go along with the book, but you can also listen to them all by themselves, and they basically help you through hypnotherapy get in touch with the nurturer, the protector, and build these aspects of yourself. So it came from somatic therapy, hypnotherapy, and then of course, 18 years of doing group work, individual sessions, and going, what are the questions and the practices that help people build this? It also comes from a year-long course that I teach, and that people are interested in, they can, go on the website and see. It's a lot of fun because we do it all together as a group, all these exercises, but again, everything in the book is easily doable on your own.
I'd love to also link that in the description for folks who are listening or watching to this, so you can check that out if you're interested. Yeah. So I think you talked about this a little bit already. So you talk about the cycle of suffering. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you developed this concept of the cycle of suffering, or where it comes from? And then the same with the circle of resilience.
Yeah, I mean, I think just jog people. Like I think I said that earlier. So cycle of suffering, like the version of it I was first introduced to is something called the drama triangle, and it comes from Stan Karpman, who was a psychologist, I believe, who's in this kind of the like field of self-help and psychology. And so that was this idea of there's these three roles and people interact in them, whether they're in relationship or with themselves. Now he calls it the victim and some other terms. But I what I felt over time was calling it the victim. I think, I mean, it can be useful. People definitely can go into victim posture. It's just happening to me. But I think it was important to me to shift that to the vulnerable self and in the way that I shared in the book because of what I'm saying, right? Like I think using the word victim when we're talking about things like, institutionalized racism and how it affects people felt really inappropriate. I think it also really missed. It's not what he was trying to do, but I was attempting to really broaden this idea and go, no, actually, it's our vulnerable self. It's this part of us that is feeling helpless for a reason because of how it's being treated. And so I wanted to really highlight that. So I riffed off of that and then broke it down into this version of neglect and like blaming yourself, putting yourself down. And the circle of resilience, I mean, I don't know of, I'm sure there are. Of course, there's like lots of different teachings on, self-compassion or boundary setting. I like models, like my brain really works this way to like look at a model and go, okay, but how would you teach something different? And watching my own journey over the years, watching the clients, developing the groups and realizing like, oh, there are counter shapes. Like when I talk to a client about how they're neglecting themselves, of course, what I'm really assessing for is, are they able to nurture themselves? When I looked back at my life, I wasn't steeped in anger and criticism, like I described to you, all right? And compassion, I mean, I hadn't thought about it. I didn't even know what that meant. Like, what do you mean? Like, love yourself, be kind to yourself. I'd never heard of that stuff. But those were the skills. Like, if I broke them down, I realized those are the major skills I learned early on that carry me through now. What does it mean to nurture myself in various different aspects? And how do I begin to protect myself? And like that was missing. It was missing for me culturally, and it was missing for me internally and in the family. And they were the counter roles to this model. And then the soul self, I think, really came from it wasn't enough. And I talk about this in the book, like nurture is very important, protector is very important. There are things that we're grappling with, I think, especially these days, that are bigger than our personal lives. And I think at least, I've seen the clients as well, need something bigger to hold that pain and that distress. When I feel the anxiety about our world, sometimes even just grief, like there's a grief that's so profound, losses in our lives, sadnesses, that yes, my nurturer is kind to me, and yes, my protector can go, okay, let's make space, but I need to lean into nature. I need to lean into maybe even a circle of people who've had grief. I need to lean into movements where I'm like, someone is working towards this, and I can be a part of that because it's too big for me to do it myself. So the soul self came out of going, I think something bigger is needed to go beyond the cycle of suffering, which I had not seen before. And then the last piece I'll say is, joy. Like no one talked to me about joy in the 20 plus years now of doing my own personal therapy. Like I think it was assumed, you do your work on trauma and then you'll feel better and then you're good to go. And I realized like about 8-9 years in, like, yes, I feel much better. I feel peace. I'm also focused mostly on work. Like there's something that's like missing. There's like a blahness in life. There's something that's not being expressed. And so that came out of a lot of personal investigation. And then with clients and groups going, what would happen if we asked early on in our healing work or throughout our lives, what brings you joy? How can we do this more enjoyably? How can we do this life with more awe and delight and pleasure? How can we make that less taboo? Why has that become taboo? Especially in activist circles, I found, right? And I have clients coming out activists or, in the suffering of this world and then hearing it's not okay to talk about joy or pleasure. And it's like, where are we going to get the strength from, the resilience from, if we're not talking about this? So that piece of the model really came from the past decade of going, I'm going to engage with this. And I got to tell you, I mean, all of it has helped. But that has really helped keep things still sweet. It's kept me still feeling like there's a reason to be alive in this hard world. And there's ways that we know how to make ourselves feel better that are not in a book, that are not just from some scientist person said, they're in our culture, actually. They're in our bodies. They're in music and singing and like the wisdom of being with each other. And let's bring that forward. So that's where it came from.
Yeah. I'm just so grateful that you expressed that because I think even in our own culture, I don't necessarily know if this idea of joy for the sake of joy or just having this. I think we do have networks, but oftentimes even within immigrant communities in the US, when you come here and you feel very isolated and alone, this concept of having to develop these types of circles of resiliency or these soul communities, that it's not readily obvious, and you breaking down these pieces is so helpful and provides so much structure in such a thoughtful way that I think anyone engaging with this will really appreciate the way that you have really thought about building resiliency and provide useful tools that allow them to also build those
I
same
hope
things for
so.
themselves.
That's lovely.
So
Yeah, I'll end with one of the nicest compliments I received recently from a reader was just saying like they like read the book and it actually made them explore laughing more, which was a new thing for them. Like it's such a, they thought it was gonna be like very serious and all this stuff, and they are a pretty serious person and they're doing very deep work and activist work, all this stuff. But they realized that they're not laughing, like they need laughter back. And so they began to do humorous things and like funny things and play with that part. And that delighted me. So because again, it just opens up this idea of what is wellness, what helps us. Maybe it will be some of the stuff we've talked about, or maybe the book will encourage you to, and we need that.
yeah, I definitely feel that. And for our viewers and listeners, I wanna give this last moment to Anjali to really share how can we get in touch with you and
Yeah,
where can we buy your book?
thank
It's the
you.
book.
Yes, I mean, I hope you're inspired too. So the book you can find really everywhere that you buy books, generally online. I definitely have a preference and a love for indie bookstores. So if you have a favorite one, just go to them. They might already have it or, ask them. But otherwise, you can buy it online anywhere. And I think they'll put up a link, probably. I think we have that where you can purchase. And then in terms of contacting me, either for like groups or trainings, all of that, one, I love to hear from you. I'm on Instagram. I think there might be a link there. Feel free to just, if you're reading the book, tag me. I love to hear from readers. Otherwise, when you go to the website, especially when you get those 9 guided meditations, automatically you'll begin to get a resilience newsletter if you want that. And that's really where you hear the news about sessions with me, trainings. And if you want to do like a deep dive on this book, then hopefully next year there will be kind of a group where we come together and do this work. So those are the places to find me. And I love to hear from readers.
Thank you so much for coming on, and for anyone listening, please do get the book and contact her because I think she's amazing. Also, please like, subscribe, and comment on the podcast so we can continue to grow our community and make this world a more
Yes,
loving
thank you for this
place.
gift, Arpita, of the work that you're doing on this podcast. It's so important to like to rethink